So yes, on behalf of all of my colleagues and collaborators from the Masala study, which stands for Mediators of Atherosclerosis in South Asians Living in America, I'm happy to share with you some of the lessons we have learned. So what we've seen recently in the United States is a biannual survey that is conducted by the US government called the N. Haynes Survey, has now started to include Asians for the first time since 2011. And so when you look at the overall diabetes prevalence by race ethnic group, you can see that it's always been highest among Hispanics, about 25% prevalence. And with the new Asian data, we found it was 19% in Asians. But when you disaggregate the Asian data, and we spent some time doing this, at least into regional buckets between East Asians, Southeast Asians, and other Asian groups, you can see that there is a clear difference between Asian groups, with South Asians and Southeast Asians having very high prevalence compared to all the other groups in the US, almost as high as Hispanics. This is relatively new knowledge for the United States because, South Asians represent only about 1 to 2% of the US population at about 5 million people. We've also seen recently in a study that was published last year that South Asians also suffer from more years lost due to heart disease. On the left here with men in the blue bar, South Asians, and these are other Asian ethnic groups, and whites here in brown. You can see that on average, men lose about 12 years of life due to ischemic heart disease, and women lose about 8 years of life. So I think that this area of interest in terms of diabetes and heart disease and the high prevalence of both is now growing in understanding in the United States. And with that background, I want to share with you what we were trying to do when we started the Masala study. This was started in 2010, and the aims were to establish a prospective community-based cohort of South Asians in the United States to determine traditional, sociocultural, behavioral, and novel risk factors that are associated with both early heart disease, so subclinical atherosclerosis, as well as type 2 diabetes, and then to compare the adjusted prevalence of risk factors to the 4 race ethnic groups in our comparison study called MESA. I'll tell you more about that. And then the long-term goal is to really understand what are the risk factors for developing incident cardiovascular disease and heart and diabetes. So with that, the design of the study was using an age group of 40 to 84 years of South Asians. We had enough funding to include 900 people to start. They had to have no existing cardiovascular disease. So someone who's already had heart attack or stroke or any procedures on their heart, like a stent or angioplasty, were excluded. So I want you to think of Masala as a relatively healthy South Asian cohort because they haven't already had a heart disease event when they enter the study with age group of 40 to 84. We conducted Masala through 2 sites, my own university in California at San Francisco, and as well as Northwestern University in Chicago. We did a pilot study that gave us good preliminary data, and then we had the baseline exam for the 900-person cohort in 2010 to 2013. We completed the second exam a couple of years ago. And as I mentioned, Masala was created to be similar to the multi-ethnic study of atherosclerosis. So we were leveraging an ongoing NIH-funded cohort that included people a little bit older, 45 to 84 years. We chose to make Masala a little younger because we know of the high prevalence of diabetes and heart disease in younger ages in South Asians and wanted to try to study that a little better. MESA had a lot more funding. They included 6,500 people with no existing cardiovascular disease. So we used the same inclusion-exclusion criteria. They included 4 race ethnic groups, so whites, blacks, Hispanics, and Chinese Americans, and they had 6 sites around the US, with Northwestern being a common site between the 2 studies. They started 10 years before Masala in 2000, and they were doing exam 5 in 2010 when we did our exam 1. So let me show you what we've accomplished just with one snapshot in Masala so far. Exam 1 was done again in 2010, and we included 906 participants. We did a social networks analysis a few years later, and I'll show you a little bit of the interesting data we have from that. And then we just completed exam 2 in 2018, where we brought everyone back and did repeat glucose tolerance tests and CT scans on the heart. And we also received a little bit of philanthropic support, and were able to expand the cohort and add 258 new participants. So both of these exams were happening simultaneously. And now we're looking forward to hopefully having funding for the third exam that would start next year. So these are the few things I want to go through with you, kind of showing you some of our most relevant data that pertains to type 2 diabetes. I'm going to show you both the prevalence and incidence of diabetes in Masala, ectopic fat stores, and then talk about diet. So much information about diet coming out. And then just a few slides talking to you about what we've learned about culture and social networks and how that influences diabetes risk. And I'll just sum up with our lessons learned. So 98% of the Masala population are immigrants to the US, and a majority come from India. 83% were born in India. And of those 83%, about 2/3 are North Indian and 1/3 are South Indian. 6% were born in Pakistan, and as you can see, 1% or less were from the other South Asian countries. Only 2% were born in the US, and again, that's because of the age that we included, age 40 to 84. So, most of the immigration that has happened to the US really started after the 1965 Act, and therefore most South Asians in the US are first generation, very few second generation. So in terms of how much time people have lived in the US, about the average years in the US was 28, or about half of a lifetime was spent in the US. So, people have generally done most or some of their schooling in India or the sending country before they arrived to the US, and maybe there was some higher education done in the US, or just employment or later life years. Socioeconomic status of Masala actually looks very similar to the general US Census data for South Asians, in that South Asians are the most highly educated group in the US, as well as have the highest family income. And we can see that in Masala as well, that 64% of men had greater than a bachelor's degree. So this is a graduate degree, 47% of women, and accordingly, the family income is also quite high in 60% of men and women. And again, this is kind of interesting for us to look at Masala in contrast to other diaspora countries like the UK, or other places like South Africa or Singapore, where the socioeconomic status of the immigrants from South Asia is quite different from the United States. So if you view the data from Masala, you have to view it from this angle, that these are highly educated immigrants who also did not have cardiovascular disease when they entered our cohort. So in terms of lifestyle behaviors and factors, I want to show you our data next to the 4 columns representing the groups in the MESA study: whites, blacks, Latinos, and Chinese Americans. South Asians is the first column. And I've excluded the South Asians who are under age 45, because MESA, as you recall, was only 45 years old to 84. So we're comparing apples to apples here. So in terms of smoking, very few South Asians are current smokers. And again, that has to do with immigration trends, high socioeconomic status. And you can see that Chinese Americans are also less likely to smoke than the other 3 groups in MESA. Alcohol consumption was quite moderate in both South Asians and Chinese, was higher in other groups in MESA again. However, exercise was abysmally low in the South Asians, and that's something of a lot of interest, because again, this is a highly educated and affluent population. You would expect they would be focusing on healthy lifestyle behaviors and exercising, not so much. So all the other 4 groups had significantly higher levels of exercise. And this is based on a 5-page questionnaire asking all sorts of different exercise, leisure time, and work occupational exercise. TV watching was also quite low in the South Asians compared to the other groups. And I would hesitate to make much of this, except that this question asked about TV and not screen time, like sitting in front of your computer or sitting in front of your devices, because I'm sure the South Asian groups would be much higher when it came to computer time. How about diabetes prevalence? So in 2010, in our first exam, the overall diabetes prevalence was 26%. 33% had prediabetes and 42% were normal. And this is based on both using a diabetes medication or an oral glucose tolerance test and fasting blood glucose. So when we compare masala men and women separately on the left and right, the South Asians are in the first bar, and you can see the South Asian men had almost 30% prevalence of diabetes compared to much lower prevalence in the other 4 ethnic groups. South Asian women had 15% prevalence. That's quite striking that between the South Asian men and South Asian women, there was almost half as much diabetes in the women. And you can see that in terms of comparing the women to the other race ethnic groups, the African American women actually had slightly higher rate of prevalence of diabetes compared to the South Asian women. It was higher than the other groups for the South Asian women, though. So when we aggregate the South Asian data together, so the adjusted diabetes prevalence, when we look at all diabetes in terms of crude prevalence, you can see it was higher in the Masala South Asians at 21%. But when we fully adjust the data, and this is adjusting for demographic factors, socioeconomic factors, behavior, smoking, alcohol use, exercise, body mass index, waist circumference, and many metabolic factors, we see that there is an even higher adjusted prevalence of diabetes in the South Asians, much, much higher than the 4 other race ethnic groups. So this data really did highlight now what we're seeing in the national data, that South Asians do have a very high prevalence of diabetes, and these are in immigrant South Asians who are well off and educated. And why is that? So we looked at the non-diabetic population in Masala, and we found that there is higher levels of insulin resistance. This is based on HOMA-IR. South Asians had higher HOMA than all the other 4 ethnic groups, and this is after adjusting for age, sex, BMI, and waist. They also had lower, significantly lower beta cell function. So again, after adjustment for the other covariates. So there seems to be priming of both, insulin resistance and beta cell dysfunction in South Asians that may be causing rapid progression to type 2 diabetes, even at earlier ages. Let's turn to some of the adiposity data we have in Masala. And as you know, the WHO has recommended slightly lower criteria for weight status and for Asians, and we do use these in Masala because we find that they actually are more predictive. And so we use overweight of 23 to 27.5 in Masala South Asians, as well as when we compare to the MESA Chinese Americans. So if we look at the BMI category, South Asians are represented by red dots. Here you can see that in terms of normal weight, the South Asians are sort of in the middle in terms of the prevalence of normal weight, with the other 2 groups that are lower being the Hispanics and the African Americans, and the other 2 groups with higher prevalence are the Chinese and whites. In terms of overweight, we're kind of all in the same prevalence range of between 40 to 50%. And obese, South Asians are again right in the middle of the prevalence of obesity. And what do we make of this normal weight group? This is the one that is quite interesting to us. And so we looked a little bit deeper at this. And if you look at this panel on the left, among those with normal weight, we looked at how many had metabolic abnormalities. And this is based on the NCEP metabolic syndrome criteria with high glucose, high blood pressure, low HDL, high triglycerides. And what we found is among South Asians, the prevalence of metabolically abnormal and metabolically normal was almost the same at around 45, 55%. And you can see that there is much more difference in the prevalence of metabolically abnormal in whites, very low in the normal weight groups, and it's like around the 30% range for the other groups. So if we explore, why there's so much metabolic abnormality even in the normal weight, we wanted to see like at what BMI do South Asians start to have metabolic abnormalities. And this graph shows that for a white person with a BMI of 25, the prevalence of any metabolic abnormality is about 30%. And if we use that same prevalence of 30%, turns out that a South Asian has equivalent prevalence at a BMI of 19.6. So that's quite striking, that an equivalent BMI to a white BMI of 25 is 19.6 among South Asians. And that is one difficult thing to counsel, patients when you're seeing them clinically, is in order for you to have the best metabolic health is really to get to a BMI of around 19.6. So we all know this well, that there is more total body fat among South Asians compared to whites. You know this well. Dr. Yudkin, with a BMI of 22.3, had only 9% body fat, and Dr. Yajanik had the same BMI, but 21% body fat. So we've actually looked at this in more detail in Masala using CT scans, and we've been able to look at stored muscle fat, fat in the liver, fat around the visceral organs, and as well as pericardial fat. And that's by using CT scans, where you take a cross section across the abdomen. You use CT scan software to be able to delineate the muscle groups, the visceral fat area, the psoas, and the subcutaneous fat. And the same with liver fat, you use different regions of the liver to look at the density of liver. So with our data, we've basically shown that South Asians store fat in all the wrong places, with more visceral fat than other groups, more intermuscular fat than the other 4 groups in MESA, more fat in the liver, because this is an inverse variable, with lower attenuation in the liver means more fat in the liver. So you can see the South Asians have the most fatty liver, and also lowest lean body mass in the South Asians. So what about progression of diabetes in Masala? I showed you the prevalence of diabetes, and we've just been able to look at incidence of diabetes now with completing our second exam. And this is showing you the rates of progression from normal glucose tolerance to impaired fasting glucose to a combination of IFG, IGT, and finally to diabetes. And you can see the overall diabetes incidence in Masala was 19.9. And the fastest conversion went from isolated impaired fasting glucose to a combination of IFG, IGT, as well as going from this combined IFG, IGT to diabetes. And when we looked at this in terms of modeling, what are the risk factors associated with rapid glycemic progression, we found there were really 3 significant risk factors. And one was visceral fat area, and that was more associated with any progression from normal glucose tolerance to any of the other pre-diabetic or diabetic states. And hepatic fat, again, it's an inverse variable, so lower hepatic fat attenuation means more fat in the liver. And so higher the fat in the liver was associated with pre-diabetes progression to diabetes. Hypertension was the other associated variable. So this really points to the fact that the liver and the visceral fat may be along the pathway mediating the progression of diabetes. So what about diet? We've spent a lot of time and energy measuring diet at every exam in our cohort. We use a validated food frequency questionnaire that was developed in Canada through the SHARE study, and that includes 165 items. And we've done many different dietary analyses using these data, and I'm only going to show you a few, and that's the newest analyses that we have looking at diet patterns, healthy and unhealthy plant-based diets, and metabolomics. So in terms of dietary patterns, there are three major dietary patterns that our participants consume, and about a third of the participants consume in majority an animal protein Western diet. A third consume this fried snacks, sweets, and high-fat dairy diet, and a third consume the fruits, vegetables, nuts, and legumes diet. And what we found was these first two diets, animal protein and fried snacks, were associated with metabolic risk, higher weight, bigger waist circumference, higher blood pressure, lower HDL. Whereas the prudent diet with fruits, vegetables, nuts was not, it was the reference group. Then what about plant-based diets? This is a new analysis that has been done by one of our collaborators at Harvard, and the poster was presented last year, so I'm going to share some of those early data with you. So what she did was to group our healthy plant-based foods like whole grains, fruits, vegetables, herbs, spices, nuts, legumes, tea, coffee into a healthy group, and then made a less healthy group of plant-based foods, refined grains, fruit juices, potatoes, etc. here. And what you can see is when you look at these analyses, she's made a plant diet index in black. That's overall all plant-based foods, as most studies have done so far. But then she has stratified this into a healthy plant-based and unhealthy plant-based diet based on these two columns that I just showed you. And what I want you to look at here is for these hypertension, metabolic syndrome, obesity, overweight, there really is no difference. There's no association between plant-based diet, whether it's healthy or unhealthy, and these factors. But when you look at fatty liver and you look at incident diabetes, you see a very interesting pattern emerge. And this is that the unhealthy plant-based diet seems to be associated with the higher odds of developing incident diabetes, and the healthy diet, plant-based diet, is associated with lower odds. And this is the same pattern you see for fatty liver. So again, providing more data that not only are fatty liver is linked in terms of associations to incident diabetes, but plant-based diets and a healthy plant-based diet may be protective, and the unhealthy may actually be harmful. Recently, we've gotten into the omics era, and we've been spending more time working on metabolomics. I'm going to show you just a couple of slides. So metabolomics is the study of small molecules that are in serum, urine, and they characterize metabolic processes. And so it's a nice way of looking at what underlies the effect of diet on metabolic health. And so the metabolomics we've done in masala shows that there are definitely interesting dietary patterns that are associated with certain metabolites. Each of the three dietary patterns I showed you, animal protein, fried snacks, they were associated with different groups of metabolites. And in the future, we're hoping that we can actually use this, serum measure of metabolites to determine diet. And this could be a nice way to follow people as you put them on a prescribed diet, or whether you're working towards a healthier diet, to make sure they're adhering to diet. And I think that this is kind of the future of, dietary work in many studies. And then we've also looked at the metabolomics of diabetes. We found 34 metabolites that are predominantly sphingomyelins, proline, and betaine that are associated with diabetes. We're looking at future prospective associations now as well. So in the last couple of minutes, I know I'm over my time, I'm going to just show you what we've learned about culture and social networks. Acculturation is, otherwise thought of as a melting pot, and as people immigrate to a new culture. We also call it a quilt, where people keep a lot of their, host culture as well as their sending culture. And we've collected many items in masala, and we've done kind of what we've done with our dietary data, where we've added all these items together and done factor analyses to see, you know, which ones group together. And doing these factor analyses, we've come up with 3 different acculturation strategies. And that is someone predominantly South Asian in their cultural beliefs and values, or is someone predominantly American, or is there an overlap between the 2 cultures, kind of a bicultural group? We found that in the orange semicircle here, the separation class, where people favor their South Asian culture, that's about 23% of our population. That the bicultural class is about 54, so about half are bicultural in their beliefs and values. And another 23% are more westernized, more American or assimilation class. And what we found was the separation class has more depression symptoms, and that's easy to understand. Is if you don't feel like you belong in a culture, you may be more depressed, feeling more isolated, marginalized. Whereas the assimilation and integration class had lower cardiometabolic risk factors. That's very interesting, because in most other cultures that have immigrated to the US, like Latinos from Mexico or Japanese from, you know, Japan, the more assimilated you get into the US culture, the unhealthier you become. But we're seeing the reverse here for South Asians. The assimilation may not be such a bad thing, maybe because it's a higher SES group and they're choosing better behaviors as a result. So we really spent some time looking at social networks, and I'm just going to show you a couple of our findings. So we asked each Masala study participant, here shown in the middle, who was in their closest social network, who are their alters, that are their network members who they speak to or communicate with the most. And what we found was the South Asians have very large social networks, but they're mostly comprised of family members, 72%, and other South Asians. Again, most are first generation, you know, South Asians who've immigrated. So of course they're, you know, their friends and are mostly South Asian. And they find that the people who have emotional closeness to their networks have better health. They are more likely to have more health discussions, and that belonging to spiritual and religious organizations are perceived as beneficial to health. What we found that I think is a really important finding for maybe both, you know, native Indians as well as immigrant South Asians is that 70% describe children as role models for healthy behavior, and these are adult children. So these people who have adult children in the US find that, you know, the adult children who eat uncooked veggies, fresh fruit daily, the dietary quality of their parents is better. And those adult children who exercise, their parents tend to meet the physical activity guidelines too. So I think this is a very important node of behavior change, is using adult children. We also found that for men, having a non-spouse, so a friend who is an exercise partner, was associated with better rates of exercise in the man. Whereas for a woman, having her spouse be her exercise partner was associated with better exercise in herself. So there's a difference by sex, that women prefer to walk with their spouse, whereas men prefer to walk with friends. So I won't get into details why, but I'm going to sum up with the lessons we've learned so far. Yes, we've also found South Asians have a very high prevalence of several metabolic risk factors, and this adverse body composition, especially liver fat, may be culprit. And several risk factors can be modified. And this is the, you know, the silver lining is we can change diet. We can go to a healthy plant-based diet. We can exercise more, and maybe men need to exercise with friends and women need to exercise with their spouse. That's good for the man. He'll have double the exercise. And then this moderate cultural beliefs, the integration strategy, I find very interesting and needs a little more thought. And then use that social networks to influence health, adult children. I didn't show you the anxiety and stress data. We are going broader and deeper in our next steps. I mentioned some of the omics work we're starting. We're also collaborating with several other studies, including the CARS study that Mohan and Anjana are a part of, and several other studies, including the UK Biobank, to combine our data. We've written 3 papers with CARS already, hopefully more. And our current future directions, I mentioned metabolomics. We're adding COVID-19 questions and serology now into Masala, trying to do repeat questionnaires to see how the pandemic is evolving in South Asians. We want to focus on heart failure and then expand Masala to include more Bangladeshis and Pakistanis. So really look at the heterogeneity among South Asians. And then cognitive function is our next growth area in Masala. I invite you to look at our study website. And I thank you again for this honor. And I want to thank our participants and study staff without whom none of this would have been possible. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much. That was an excellent and eye-opening session, genuinely. You know, there's so many things that sitting in India, you don't really think about. A simple thing like using adult kids as influencers for exercise would have never struck any of us sitting here. And the striking differences of